BJ Mafia, what's poppin'? Jags fans, it's one of the most exciting times of the NFL offseason for the Jags. The NFL draft is just right around the corner. We're 8 days away from the start of the 2024 NFL draft, which will begin on April 25th in Detroit, Michigan. And the Jaguars had a very successful offseason so far when you really talk about free agent signings and guys that we've let walk in this year's free agency class. And Trent Baalke has done a very good job, and now he has an opportunity to truly redeem himself with this year's draft class and to make sure that we continue to add a lot more talent to this team to give us a lot of optimism going into the 2024 season after what we've seen all of our contemporaries in the AFC South do, as the Colts have had a good offseason, the Texans had a good offseason, and the Titans had a very good offseason. The Jaguars have to continue to keep pace, and they have to continue to add talent to this roster, and they have an opportunity to do that with this year's draft class. Now, I'm going to be talking about my perfect draft strategy going into this year's draft. Now, this is not a mock draft per se. I've already done a handful of mock drafts. If you guys want to go ahead and check that out, I will go ahead and link to it up above. The most recent one was with Jordan DeLugo over from Gen Jag. I know you guys are very familiar with him as well too. Make sure you guys go ahead and check that out. But I want to talk about what I'm going to do if I'm Trent Baalke and what's the strategy I'm going to aim towards going into this year's draft class. Now, before I go ahead and dive deep into all of that, before we go ahead and do it, if you guys please could, go ahead and drop me a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe bell to stay tuned for more Jaguars content that I do here on YouTube. And make sure you guys also go ahead and follow me on my socials, especially on Twitter. I'm very active and I'm on there every single day. The link tree will be in the description down below so that you guys can go ahead and check that out. But Jags fans, let's actually go ahead and get into today's video talking about the Jaguars strategy going into this year's draft class. Now, for you guys that know, the Jaguars have 8 total picks in this year's draft. They have a pick in every single round, and they have 2 picks in the 4th round. They have picks overall 17, 48, 96, 114, 116, 153, 212, and 236 overall in this year's draft class. And just for the sake of this argument, I'm not going to be, making any trades. So that means no trading up, no trading back. We're just going to stand pat for the sake of this argument. Now, what are some of the Jaguars' biggest needs going into this year's draft that they need to fill on this roster? And this is in no particular order. They absolutely, at some point, need to go get a wide receiver 1 this offseason, and we're going to talk just the draft. The Jaguars need a wide receiver 1 opposite side of Gabe Davis, who you just paid big money to this offseason. You can keep Christian Kirk in the slot, who's a very high-quality producing wide receiver coming out of the slot. You've still got Evan Ingram, who's one of the best pass-catching tight ends in the game of football with a wide range in his skill set, in his arsenal. You need that opposite threat, a guy who can be a physical dominant force on the outside, that X factor for Trevor Lawrence. Trevor Lawrence is now going into his 4th year. He's never played with a top 15 receiver in the game of football. And I mean no disrespect to Calvin Ridley. He has not. We had a generational talent. We have one. We've seen the talent. And he's still yet to have played with a top 15 wide receiver. Something needs to change. We need to address that in this year's draft. Secondly, the Jaguars need to go out there and they need to get a corner opposite side of Tyson Campbell. Regardless if Tyson Campbell is going to be retained after the season, as he's on the last year of his contract, which is crazy how time flies by. The Jaguars need to go get someone who is a good lockdown corner opposite side of him, because we know Tyson Campbell, when he's healthy, he's a very good upper echelon corner who's only going to continue to get better, especially in a contract year. You need to go and get that guy with good length, versatility, and a guy who can run a sub 4.3 or a 4.4 40. Speed and athleticism on the outside. We need that kind of game changer opposite side of Tyson Campbell, and ideally, you'd like to move Ronald Darby somewhere into the slot. Secondly, the Jaguars need to continue to work in the trenches, and that means specifically protecting your franchise quarterback. We understand Luke Fortner was arguably the worst starting center in the game of football last year. I don't need to reiterate that. But the Jaguars addressed it. They got Mitch Morse. You retained Ezra Cleveland. You restructured the contract of Brandon Sheriff. How do you continue to fortify the interior of that offensive line and continue to make it healthy and strong in order to protect your franchise quarterback? You've got your tackles going into this year. You've got Cam Robinson, you've got your swing tackle in Walker Little, and you've got your franchise right tackle in Anton Harrison. How do we continue to get depth and fortify the interior of that offensive line? Because I promise you, knock on wood, if the Jaguars have one injury on the interior of that offensive line, it looks a whole lot worse. We feel good going into the season, looking at our offensive line and saying, okay, here's our starting five in the trenches. I feel good about what it is. But we have one guy go down, it looks a whole lot worse. Continue to get depth and continue to get pieces that you can add to solidify the interior of that offensive line. And lastly, the Jaguars need to continue to work in the trenches, but on the opposite side. Get someone who can get push on the interior as an interior defensive lineman, or get an edge 3. That is something that the Jaguars have been seeking for, and they did not do last season. They did not go get an edge 3. They had opportunities to get a Jadeveon Clowney, to get a Leonard Floyd, and they did not do that. They fumbled the bag with that. And honestly, looking back on it, it's okay. Now's your opportunity to redeem yourself. You have Eric Armstead. Go and get a guy that can get push in the interior. Maybe a guy like a Johnny Newton. Maybe a guy like a Byron Murphy. Get an edge 3 opposite side of Josh Allen and Trayvon Walker. Go and get a guy like a Latu, a Dallas Turner, Jared Verse. And it doesn't have to be first round guys. I'm just thinking of the names that come to mind. You have to continue to address that front seven and to get a good push, because this defensive line can turn into Saxonville 2.0 real quick if we continue to add the right pieces. Now, enough about speculation about what we need to do. Let me get into my draft strategy. Now, the Jaguars could very well go best player available, because the Jaguars do have that kind of wiggle room right now to go into the draft and go best player available, but I'm not going to do that. I think in the first round, if the Jaguars are serious about making this team a Super Bowl contender, you go out there and you get a wide receiver 1. So the first round, the Jaguars should absolutely be targeting a wide receiver at 17 overall, right? I know a Marvin Harrison Jr., Roma Dunze, or a Malik Neighbors, those guys are not going to be there at 17, but you still need to address getting that wide receiver 1, and to make this a high-powered offense, really take your capabilities and take it to that next level, and to help your franchise quarterback, whether that's a Brian Thomas Jr., Xavier Worthy, Xavier Legette, or if you want to go in a different direction, go Troy Franklin. Who else am I forgetting? A.D. Mitchell. There's a handful of guys you could go out there and get. And obviously, I'm not saying it necessarily has to be 17 overall, but the first thing that this Jaguars team should take is a wide receiver 1. That should be the first priority on this team's draft board. You are going to make this offense look astronomically different. It's going to become a high-powered offense, and especially with Doug Peterson more than likely taking back full-time play calling, you are going to see how explosive this offense could be. Because imagine if we had an A.D. Mitchell or Brian Thomas Jr. opposite side of Gabe Davis. You have Kirk in the slot. You can keep Zay Jones as your 4th wide receiver. Parker Washington's your 5th wide receiver. You've still got Etienne out of the backfield, and you got Evan Ingram, who can line up in the slot and do a bunch of different things across the formation. That is a high-powered offense. That should be the Jaguars' first priority. Now, the second thing the Jaguars should go out there and target after addressing their wide receiver 1 issues is going out there and getting a cornerback opposite side of Tyson Campbell. I've talked about the importance of athleticism and versatility, especially in this Ryan Nielsen system and this defense that he's going to be taking over. The Jaguars can get good value in depth and get a starting quality defensive back in the 2nd and 3rd round. Some names that come to mind, potentially a TJ Tampa, Ennis Rakestraw. He might be a late 1st round pick, but you never know how the board falls. Maybe get a guy like Kyrie Jackson, Renardo Green, Jarian Jones. There is a handful of guys, even Chris Abram-Drames, I'm a big fan of, from Missouri. There's a lot of good, high quality potential DBs that you could get in the 2nd and 3rd round that the Jaguars should absolutely address after getting their wide receiver 1. Upgrade the skill positions, continue to get that athleticism and that versatility at that position, and make sure you get a premium. I would feel very good if, hypothetically speaking, we had a Renardo Green, a Tyson Campbell, and then you can slide Ronald Darby into the slot. I think your secondary looks a lot better, not just this season, but going forward, moving into the future. Now, the third thing the Jaguars should absolutely address after addressing their wide receiver position, after addressing the defensive back position, is fortifying the interior of that offensive line, and specifically the trenches. The Jaguars need to do everything in their willpower to continue to protect their franchise quarterback. And I understand the argument for taking an offensive tackle in the first round. I'm not on that train whatsoever, even though I obviously want to protect Trevor Lawrence. But the Jaguars, they have their tackles going into this year. The Jaguars, they have their starting 5 going into this year on the offensive line. Now in the 3rd round, you can go get a Christian Mahogany, a Cooper Beatty, Zach Zinter, a handful of guys out there on the interior that you can just develop behind a Mitch Morse, a Brandon Sheriff, and an Ezra Cleveland. You're not asking these rookies in the 3rd and 4th round to come in there and be your starting day 1 left guard or right guard, or guys that could potentially turn into your center into the future. This is the Jaguars' move and strategy that they should go for. Fortify the offensive line, let these guys learn and grow and develop behind some seasoned veterans, and that should be the thinking in the process going into the 3rd and 4th round. Get interior offensive linemen. Now, kind of going into the late 4th, into the early 5th, get some edge rushers, get some guys off of the defensive trenches that you can put into that front 7 that's going to be impactful players. And like I said, you're maybe not asking these guys to come in and be immediate starters, but these guys can be solid rotational guys, especially on a defensive front. You take a look at our defensive front outside of the names I've already talked about: Josh Allen, Trayvon Walker, Eric Armstead, Jeremiah Ledbetter, Devon Hamilton, Roy Robertson Harrison. But now you can go and target guys like Justin Aboibe, Tavondre Sweat, guys like Muhammad Kamara, Nelson Caesar, etc. There's a handful of guys that I believe late in the 4th round, early 3rd round, that could come in and be high quality, rotational pieces for this Jaguars front 7. The Jaguars absolutely need to take this defensive line and continue to add to it. The trenches just got absolutely blown out of the waters. The final 6 weeks of the season where the Jaguars went 1-5, we couldn't stop a nosebleed. Teams were running the ball right down our throats. We couldn't pass protect or run block for Travis Etienne or Trevor Lawrence or even CJ Beathard in week 17. The Jaguars need to do everything to address the trenches, both on the offensive front and on the defensive front. And lastly, the Jaguars need to take one more secondary player. In rounds 5 through 7, I believe that you should just continue to add to that group, whether that's a Cam Hart, who's probably going to be a zone hybrid safety at the next level from Notre Dame. You take a look at Josh Newton, Josh Wallace. There's a handful of guys late in the draft that should fall to the rounds 5, 6, or 7 that I think could still come in and potentially be solid rotational guys if injuries were to occur, knock on wood. These are guys I think you need to go with, and I think mostly, specifically, you still need to go into the trenches. I'd like to get one more guy late into the draft in the secondary, but I think otherwise, you should come out of this draft, 3 or 4 of your guys should be in the trenches, both offensively and defensively. You need to fortify the trenches. I cannot overemphasize that enough. And I'm just going to throw one more in there just for the sake of argument. I think the Jaguars should take a kicker with their last pick at 236 overall. Get a guy, take a swing on him. There's no pressure on him being the 7th round selection to come in here and to be the day 1 starter. But if you get a guy who you think can be your kicker moving forward, because Joey Sly's been inconsistent throughout his career, Riley Patterson does not have the leg like some other kickers do, even though, we have a special place in our hearts for Riley Patterson. The Jaguars need to take at least a swing on a kicker and give the guy an opportunity to come in and be our kicker moving forward. But that's really it. I don't have much else about this draft strategy. Just to recap, the Jaguars should go in a similar order of addressing wide receiver 1, cornerback, interior offensive line, defensive front 7, so somewhere in the trenches on the defensive side of the ball, get another guy in the secondary, probably rounds 5 through 7, and then continue to fortify the trenches and possibly take a kicker with their last pick. That's what I think the Jaguars should go, and that should be their mindset going into this year's draft. I'm not saying it's wrong if the Jaguars want to go corner or edge or tackle with their first overall selection. I'm okay with best player available. This is just what I would do. Go and get Trevor Lawrence, his bona fide wide receiver 1 for the foreseeable future. Jags fans, please let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. What do you guys make of my draft strategy, and what do you guys think the Jaguars should do in this year's draft? Not specifically a player, but direction that they should go to. I want to know your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. And Jags fans, before I let you guys go and get up out of here, if you guys have not seen, I've already done a full draft profile and film breakdown of 3 draft prospects on my Patreon. Guys like Terrion Arnold, Jared Verse, and Kool-Aid McKinstry. If you guys want to go ahead and check that out and help support me on my Patreon, the link tree will be in the description down below so that you guys can go ahead and check that out. But Jags fans, thanks again for sticking around throughout the whole video. Brett James, aka BJ, I'm out, y'all. And like always, let's go Jags.